So, greetings EPQers. A video for you just to help with your research reviews, which you should have already started, but hopefully this will give you a bit of clarity. Now, a lot of this stuff is in your handbook, if not all of it is in your handbook. So what I'm trying to do is just point out key bits and distill key areas for you. Obviously, any questions at all, do feel free to email me or message me on chat, etc., etc. So off we go. So the research review, which is what you should have started or at least have planned out, is worth. It's a little bit more complicated, but let's keep it simple. Let's say that it's AO2 on the mark scheme and it's worth 12 marks, and the EPQ is out of 54. So we're looking at 22% of the total. So it's important that you do it well and get it right, especially given that most of you are aiming for A stars or A's, and the A star bracket starts at about 50, 51 out of 54, and it's perfectly achievable because there's no exam stress and pressure. If you do everything calm and measured and work on the feedback, there's no reason why you all can't get 54 out of 54. So anyway, it's perfectly achievable. But anyway, the research review is 22% of the total, 12 out of 54 marks. So it's something that needs to be done and done well. Okay, so what is the research review for? Sometimes understanding what you're writing and its purpose can be quite useful. So what the research review is for is to put the question in context and give the examiner, which is me, the information that I need to understand your discussion. So you need to assume that I am intelligent, thank you very much, but not necessarily knowledgeable about your subject. So you will need to explain some of the core concepts, principles, ideas, theorists, etc., etc. Now, just because of the way things go, there are some subjects that obviously I know a lot about and some I don't. But you have to assume for the purposes of this exercise that I am intelligent, but don't actually have any detailed knowledge on the subject. So there we go. Right. So let's have a look at the mark scheme. Let's see what the exam board want. And these three little extracts have been copied from the exam board. So this is what they have told us that they want. So they want information and resources relevant to the research. So you need to have done a study of all the sources and selected relevant research for this research review, not just any old stuff chucked in there. It has to be relevant to your question, and that is extremely important. So the next point to think about with this research review is the information can't just simply be retyped. It has to be analysed and synthesised in reference to the research question. So you need to be saying, well, here's this background information or background piece of context or theory or story or element of history, and this is why I'm telling it to you. This is why it's relevant to understanding my question. Don't worry, we'll put these in a bit of context later on. The other thing that you have to do, which is one of those, it's a little bit tick boxy, but I can see what they're saying. You need to establish clear and concise links between the bits of information. Now, in a sense, that's often just a sentence linking, say, your research review on, finance with society, or with kind of. I don't know. I'm panicking. I don't have an EPQ in mind. Again, it's about linking these various sections together with a sentence, and we'll come back to it. So the thing with research reviews and obviously EPQ in general is that our advice is always a bit sort of vague, because EPQs are so massive and vague, and you can do, well, your EPQ shouldn't be vague, but it can be chosen from a huge variety of areas, from and you guys are doing AI, legalization of prostitution, the American dream, it's just a vast area. So the advice and the guidance has to be a bit general so that it works for you all. But obviously, if you want a bit more specific stuff, then come to me directly. But anyway, so the research review is providing the context that someone needs to understand your discussion, which happens next. Now, the context needs to be relevant, and it will very much depend on your EPQ. So here are some of the kind of areas that can appear in some or all of your research review. So it can be historical events relevant to the discussion. So if you're doing a bit more of a historical EPQ, it could be the story building up to a particular event that you're looking at. Especially if that story is crucial to the argument. So Louis, I think, is doing the French causes of French Revolution or something like that. So there you do need to understand what happened before the French Revolution in order to be able to understand the arguments that you're going to make about what caused it. So actually a little bit of a history of maybe 50 years before the revolution could actually be really useful and really important, but you do need to say why it's useful and important. Other things that you might do would be key theories or concepts. So if you're doing an EPQ on the nature of autism or mental illness or something a little bit more sciencey, who are the key theorists in this field? So if you're doing what causes autism, you would look at, say, theorists who talk about it being genetic, theories who talk about there being environmental aspects to it, nutritional aspects to it. So it would be what are the key theories that you would need to understand the discussion, if that makes sense. Now, another thing that can be extremely important, an extremely important part of your research review, is definitions, especially where they're complex or relevant. So it could be keywords in your question, it could be keywords that you're going to use later on in the essay. Now, a bit of a trap here is just defining so many things that aren't that relevant and that are pretty simple and obvious. We really want detailed definitions of things that a normal person might not understand and where there's some significant debate about them. So one that springs to mind, it might not be the perfect example, but would be artificial intelligence. So if you're doing an EPQ on artificial intelligence, what is the definition of artificial intelligence? Because actually, from memory, there's a bit of debate. When do you declare something to be artificial intelligence, and when is it simply a good program? And different theorists and philosophers and programmers have different ideas about what makes something true artificial intelligence. So the research review would be exactly where you have that kind of debate. Well, theorist X says that artificial intelligence is defined by this, theorist Y says this. In my EPQ, I'm going to go with theorist Y because blah, blah, blah. So again, it's not just saying artificial intelligence is this, a computer is this, a processor is this. That's not really what the research review is doing. So it can be historical events relevant to the discussion. It can be key theories or concepts. It can be definitions where complex or relevant. It can be other things as well. These are just some kind of ideas, but the principle you need to go back to is what's the background information someone needs to understand my EPQ, and I need to show that I've looked at it all, synthesized it, and analyzed it. Okay. So let's have a look at, as a kind of example, a historical EPQ. Was James I a successful monarch? Now, the student who did this one had a discussion structure, and that can be something to actually have laid out in your mind before you do the research review, but it can be chicken and egg. Different EPQs evolve in different ways. But this student did, was he a military successful monarch? Was he economically successful? Was he politically successful? Was he religiously successful? And that's a classic kind of way of splitting up a historical question. Now, in the research review, it was important to look at the previous monarch and the situation and problems and systems and structures they'd left James I. So a big part of this student's research review was the reign of Elizabeth, who came before James, and the institutions that she created, the mistakes she made, the successes that she'd had, and so making sure that you understood why James I was facing particular problems by looking at the reign of Elizabeth. Now, what you shouldn't do in an essay like this would say be giving 500 years worth of British history leading up to James I, because it's just not really relevant to the argument, to the question. Now, an EPQ, as a question like this, actually, you could do a much more chronological structure if you wanted to. The 50 years before James I's reign, or the 25 years of Elizabeth's reign, or whatever. But actually, splitting it up into the same areas of argument as the discussion, I think actually worked quite well. Now, what else could you do in this much more historical research review? Well, you can look at the key events of the reign of James, and this student broke it down into some biographies of key individuals, so we understood who was doing what, who they were, their background, their motivation, how they fed into the kind of political structure of the time. And they also looked at some of the military events, economic events, and political events, religious events of James I's reign as well. And that's perfectly valid, and you absolutely can do that in the research review. What you have to be a little bit careful with there is turning your research review into the discussion. So the research review shouldn't address your discussion question in a great deal of depth, but there should be argument about the relevant facts and theories that contribute to your discussion, if that makes any sense whatsoever. Okay, so other kinds of questions, as we've been talking about before. So important technical ideas. So should the world ban military artificial intelligence? So if you're doing this research review, well, actually the definition of AI would be extremely important. What's the best definition, why, and how does it feed into your EPQ? So that, there could be several pages of what is AI, because that's just fundamental to the question. If you think back to the previous research review for James I, what is the definition of military, what's the definition of economic, what's the definition of political? We know what those words mean. I don't think that's particularly relevant to that question. So when we're looking at definitions, what we don't want is, say, 10 different definitions just vaguely associated with your EPQ. But in this case, like you can see, I think it would actually be a really important part of the EPQ research review. Now, what else could you do? Well, the uses of AI, the theories of AI. So if you could do quite a lot, or should do quite a lot, on the various ways that AI is used in the military. And that's giving really important context, so facts, figures, methods, systems, but it's not directly having the debate should these things be used. It's telling you what is used and how they're used, but it's not having the discussion debate that happens later on. If you can hear a meowing, it's not me, it's my Siamese cat. Mimi, hey Mimi, can you come and join in the EPQ presentation? No? Are you? Possibly. Okay, so at some point there'll be a cat racing. Oh, there we go. There you go. There's Meme, just to show I'm not going crazy and making cat noises. Although I do that sometimes if I'm bored. Anyway, we're getting off topic. Oh, Meme. So, with this research review, you'll need to think about what's relevant. So, for example, is how AI works in general significant? So do you need to have a sort of an explanation of how artificial intelligence works? Yes, you could, if that's relevant to the question. If you're talking about how artificial intelligence works in a specific way, which means that it can't make moral decisions, and the lack of a human morality on the battlefield is your main reason why you shouldn't have military artificial intelligence, then yes, actually the way it works could be extremely important. And so how deep do you need to go into something like that? Well, again, it's about whether it's relevant to the discussion. So, and about what someone needs to understand. I mean, I am hopeless with maths and programming skills and so on and so forth. So, again, you don't need to aim it specifically at me. You need to aim it at a kind of at an intelligent but not a sort of detailed, someone without a detailed knowledge, sorry, of the EPQ. So, should you go into, the minutiae of programming? Should you look at different programming languages that create AI for this question? I would say probably not, because I don't think that helps understand the question. Okay, so more, looking at, definitions in a research review again. So, looking at this sort of question, to what extent is mental illness genetic? Well, here some definitions of mental illness could be extremely important, especially if there's medical debate about what is and what isn't mental illness. Just the things that sort of leap to mind would be things like, to what extent is something, some kind of behavior like aggression, to what extent is that a mental illness, and to what extent could that be a kind of hormonal imbalance? So, not a mental illness at all. Then you could look at types of mental illness, so the symptoms, the diagnosis, and whether there's any debate or discussion or synthesis needed there. Shush. Thank you. Now, what you'd also need to understand is genetics, and you'd need an understanding here of what genes are and how they influence things in general. So the cat's about to jump across the screen. Oh, there you go. That's fast. So this would be very much, what are genes? How do they work? How can they build the brain as a general object? How can they inform various habits and behaviors that are again relevant to the debate? Now, obviously there'll be more things that you need to discuss, but I'm just trying to give you an idea of what might appear in a research review. And one of the things that we've really got to be careful with, again, is making sure we show analysis, synthesis, and relevance. So analysis, what is it? How is it relevant to my question? Synthesis, taking a huge number of sources, breaking them down into easily understandable, digestible chunks of information that are relevant for the EPQ, rather than just copying and pasting thousands of pages. And relevance, make sure it is relevant to answering the question. Okay, right, what have we got next? Okay, so how should you structure your research review? Well, there's a couple of ways of doing it. Well, there's almost infinite ways of doing it. Chronologically. Now, this can make a lot of sense if you're looking at a history EPQ or history type EPQ. But as I said before, you could still do that thematically. It depends on what works best for you and the flow of your EPQ. Now, I think if you're looking at, say, something like the Israel-Palestine conflict, where one side does one thing and then the next side do another thing, and then the other side respond, and actually the kind of sequence of events is actually quite important to the question that you're trying to debate, then I think a chronological structure is extremely helpful. On the other hand, breaking things up into themes can work really well when the order of development isn't actually that significant. So is it significant that depression was diagnosed before schizophrenia or something? I'm making that up. You see what I mean? So it's where it's really the thematic concepts that you need to understand, rather than the order in which things came out. Now, again, the beauty of EPQ is that sometimes it can be both. There may be some information in your research review that is really important, that it's presented sort of chronologically, because the sequence of events is crucial. And then there might be another part of your research review where the sequence isn't that relevant. It's just very important that you have an understanding of three concepts that evolved over 100 years. So don't feel that you have to do a chronological EPQ or a thematic research review or a thematic one. It can be a mixture of both. That's it. Thank you. Right. So some key mistakes that people make. So number one is they put in stuff that's irrelevant to the question. It's so easy to pad a research review. You could do a 10,000 word research review without any difficulty whatsoever and not really get any marks for it, because it's just not relevant. You're doing something on literature, Shakespeare, so you just write, a 5,000 word biography of Shakespeare. You can massively up your word count, but if it's not relevant, you don't score any marks. Now, we need to be a little bit careful with that. The dividing line there rather is a bit grey. A little bit of context, a little bit of history, a little bit of a story for a paragraph, can be really interesting and draw the reader in. So going back to the kind of artificial intelligence EPQ or idea, if you spent 4 or 5 lines talking about a really interesting story about the development of AI or the Turing test or something like that, then yeah, that's great, that's interesting, that's contributing to the interest and engagement and enthusiasm of the EPQ overall. If you turn that into 2,000 words, vaguely interesting but no marks. So again, a slight grey area, but hopefully you see what I mean by that. Now, what's the next biggest mistake you can make? Well, making it descriptive, or rather purely descriptive and not analytical, or having that idea of synthesis. So taking all of these sources and distilling them down into a coherent kind of explanation of an event, definition, concept, theory, etc., etc. So make sure, and again, it's tricky because there is a lot of description involved, because sometimes you have to explain what something is. But you need to make sure there is also analysis and synthesis. Another thing that again is not going to sort of cause huge trauma, but it can make your EPQ repetitive, and that is if you drift into the discussion or the argument section. So you're talking about a crucial piece of background, and you start actually having the argument that you then repeat later on in your discussion. So just make sure that whilst you're being analytical and may well be being argumentative, it's not actually about your EPQ discussion. It's about, it's an argument about a definition or a concept or a theory that leads to the discussion. Now, again, another thing that is extremely important that you do, and that is linking these sections together. And often that is only a sentence or two, and sometimes it can actually be a little bit of a tick boxy bullshitty thing where you just make sure you've got a sentence that links economics and politics together. So, for example, if you're going back to, say, the James I one, where you've done a whole thing on, the economics of the British Isles, and then you say, for your next section, which is religion, you could say, the historian David Starkey has said that economics is largely irrelevant, and that it is, the main focus of politics at the time was, religion. So you're referring to that other kind of definition or concept or idea, and sometimes it can be a bit artificial, and sometimes it's a bit more implied. But that is one of the things on the mark scheme, and it is something that you have to do. Okay, so the last mistake is poor structure. So students not putting in headings, just putting in this massive chunk of text that is really quite hard to digest and also hard to refer back to. Sometimes when I'm marking an EPQ, I might be reading the discussion and see that you're talking about a definition like euphoria or something. I go, oh, I don't think I remember what that is. So I go back to the research review, and if it's just 8 pages of solid text and I can't find that definition even though I know it's there, it's a bit irritating. One thing you really have to remember with EPQ is that it's a project, and the goal of the project is to communicate information. And so if you have headings and graphs, and you could even have color. Think this isn't like a sort of sit down, write a history essay in 45 minutes, where you sort of get penalised / frowned upon if you're using bullet points. This is a real project where the purpose is clarity of expression. And if that's a graph, if that's multiple headings, if that's a diagram of some sort, then yeah, absolutely go for it. Okay, so I think that's the last slide, certainly the last cat. Anyway, I hope that makes sense, and I hope that's helpful in terms of the research reviews. Now, by all means, send me stuff if you want feedback, guidance, etc., etc. One thing that I just cannot stress enough, or rather two things that I cannot stress enough, yes, is meow, first of all. That's probably the most important point. But second most important point is the EPQ guide. Is that right? Yeah. That's got everything in it. If you read it carefully, that will answer, I would have thought, 99% of your questions. The other thing that I just cannot tell you strongly enough to do is to look at the exemplars that I put on the group chat. I mean, the ones that are on the VLE are good. The ones that I put on the group chat are better. So, I mean, I know it's a bit boring reading someone else's EPQ, perhaps. I mean, I thought they were quite interesting. But anyway, have a look at them. Look at what they did, how they laid it out, how they made their arguments, because those are all, very good EPQs. Anyway, I hope that's helpful, and I'll, of course, try and be in touch every week. But that is it for the time being. Take care.